I guess we're going to go ahead and get started. This is the state of the Metasploit Framework. This is the 5th time I've given this basic idea of a talk at Derbycon. It's become kind of a tradition that I enjoy doing, where I share with you the things that I think are the coolest new additions to the framework in the last year. And I am James Lee, but my real name is Egypt. I am a Metasploit developer and have been a developer for quite a while. I first got commit access in 2008, where I promptly broke master, and with my first commit, mind you. And I've been following in that tradition for quite a while. I'm also now the community manager, which means if you have questions, I'm usually the guy you want to come talk to. I spend a lot of time on Twitter these days. I control, at least in part, the @Metasploit Twitter handle. So if the response from @Metasploit is snarky and useful, that was me. So first I want to start off with some statistics and graphs and stuff. All of the stuff I'm going to show you is available either through fancy git log commands or the GitHub search page. The search page actually gives you an awful lot of really powerful capabilities for filtering and stuff. So if you're interested in like the statistics behind Metasploit and how many people work on it and stuff, the GitHub page is really great for that. And git log is also really powerful. Most of the time, it's too obscure to really want to bother with it, though. So, yeah, if you fancy the command line and love awk, then git log is for you. There are 229 new modules this year, and I think it's interesting that we ended up with this breakdown. You'll notice encoder there at the corner, a very small little stack. Encoders are actually quite rare, new encoders in the framework, because most of the encoders we have are sufficient for the job. You know, we already have Shakata Ganai, which is fantastic for x86. You know, we've already got command encoders for being able to get rid of all the bad characters in your command injection exploits. So for the most part, encoders don't move that much, but I'm going to talk about those a little bit later. We merged over 800 pull requests this year. Almost all of those came from you. Lots of modules came in that way, lots of new features, and those 800 pull requests are all publicly available. You can go see the discourse on them and see the back and forth with code review and how we help people shepherd their modules through and make their code better, make it easier for us to maintain down the road. So of those 800 pull requests, we had 176 unique authors. That command line at the bottom is actually a little more complicated because we started breaking up the Metasploit Framework repository into multiple smaller repositories. So the actual command to grab this number comes with a big for loop and some ugliness that I don't want to bore you with. But I think that number is pretty amazing. 176 people gave their time and their effort and their love of security to the Metasploit project in the last year. That's amazing. That's fantastic. And I really appreciate every single one of those contributions. Those authors created 4,765 commits. If you're new to the project, this might seem intimidating because we move pretty fast. There's a lot of stuff in the framework. There's a lot of code. There's a lot of new things coming in. But the GitHub interface makes it pretty easy to visualize this, and it makes it pretty easy to contribute new code. So don't be intimidated by the size of the framework or the number of people already contributing. You can contribute too. Your contributions are worthwhile, and I want to see every one of them. Of those commits, I can't see the number, 40-something% of them came from people that have never been paid by Rapid7. So a few of those people that I count as having been paid by Rapid7 are no longer in Rapid7's employ, or in the case of OJ, only do contracting work with us. So they occasionally still give us stuff that we don't pay them for. And I think this number is also pretty fucking fantastic. We put a lot of effort into the framework. We also put a lot of effort into our commercial products. But this is really about the community. The Metasploit community is enormous, and it includes all of you. And the fact that almost half of all of our commits come from people who are interested in the project and passionate about security and want to improve the world through Ruby code. That's amazing. There have also been 1,588 dead references to OSVDB, and that's my little passive-aggressive jab at them for shutting down a service that I think was really super useful. We have all of the data that came from OSVDB. That stuff still exists, but we need someone to lead it. If you're interested and willing to bring this service back up, become the new OSVDB, please come talk to me. I would love to see this thing continue. CVE has its failings for sure. OSVDB had some troubles, but the resources that it provided were amazing, and I'm really sad to see it go. So if you want to work on it, please come talk to me or any of the other Metasploit people, and we really need a leader for this. So now I'm going to jump into some new features, new stuff that I think you'll enjoy. Mostly this is a grab bag, so it's going to be kind of jumpy back and forth. It's not super, not super related. So bear with me as some of it's a little choppy. First is, as I mentioned, we're breaking up Metasploit into some smaller pieces. We have this library called Rex that contains a whole bunch of stuff. And most of it is in some way related to exploitation, but not directly related to each other. So there's a whole bunch of things like XOR encoding stuff lives in there. All of our polymorphic engines live in there. Most of our protocol libraries live in Rex. All kinds of just random one-off things that someone needed for an exploit live in Rex. So we're trying to break those out into smaller pieces that are easier to manage, easier to test, easier to visualize. And that's an ongoing project that's been in the works for several years now, a little bit at a time. And part of the advantage of that is smaller chunks of code are just easier to understand. You know, if you have one repository with 1,000 lines of code, as opposed to Metasploit Framework, which previously had almost 1 million lines of code, one of those is going to be a lot easier to wrap your head around. So we continue to break this thing apart into smaller, more manageable chunks, and it also saves on testing time as well. So we see all of the tests run for Rex text only run when Rex text is updated, and we don't have to go through that same step for any new change to the framework. We added a couple of new msfconsole commands, and typically things like this come about when someone finally gets pissed off enough about it and fixes it. I've been typing show options for like 10 years, and goddamn, that's 5 extra characters that I never should have had to type this whole time. I wonder how many hours of my life have been wasted typing SHO when I could have just typed options the whole fucking time. So now I've got this other directory called tools, and I was originally going to call this slide tools reorganization, but there was never any organization in it to begin with. It was just a big pile of code with a whole bunch of different purposes. So now we've broken that down into all of these categories. The one that you'll probably end up spending most of the time on is dev and exploit, where those are the things that you can use for either interacting with the framework to do some sort of introspection, find out like module authors and that sort of thing. The exploit directory contains some fun things to simplify the creation of exploits, and dev helps you out with the actual process of developing stuff for Metasploit. The others are also useful, but I feel like that's probably where you're going to spend most of your time. One of those new tools is MSU Finder, and I think this is really neat. It's something that Sinner wrote, Wei Chen. It grabs all of the patch links for any new Microsoft KB. So you run MSU Finder and you give it a KB number, or excuse me, not a KB, an MS advisory number, and it pulls down a list of all of the MSU patch files for you to download and extract information from. So if you want to analyze a patch, this makes it way easier. You just download all the things. The next big thing is Mettle. It's a new payload written mostly from scratch in portable POSIX C. So that means it runs on all kinds of shit. It runs on MIPS routers, it runs on Android devices. JDuck demoed that a little bit yesterday with his stage fright exploit, which is now in the queue and should be landed in the next few days. So you've got a payload that works very much the same way as Meterpreter, but written with the plan of being portable the whole time. It uses Muscle as its libc, which is a huge improvement over the previous attack plan of using Android's Bionic libc, which was huge and did a whole bunch of stuff that we didn't really need. And because of the way the Android build system changed, it wasn't really easy to pull it out of the Android build system anymore. They went from everything being small little pieces that are easy to interact with on their own to now Android is one giant monolithic build. So pulling the libc out of it was a pain in the ass, and this is just much better all around. Brent and Adam are going to be talking about this at 1 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. So if you're interested in highly portable POSIX C and the awesome evil things that you can do with it, I highly recommend you go check out their talk too. We also added some support for mainframes due to some great work by Soldier of Fortran and Big Endian Smalls, two contributors who I actually met here at Derbycon a couple of years ago. And I love their work. It's a lot of fun. They built payloads and an authenticated RCE exploit for the job control system, which is brilliant. The way the job control system works is you have an FTP server and you upload a file to the FTP server, and the mainframe goes, "Oh, you have a new job for me. I'll pick up that file and run whatever the fuck you want." Sweet. The next big thing is module documentation. And we've always had the info command at msfconsole that gives you a basic rundown of anything that the module author wanted you to know. And that's that chunk, if you're looking at the source code, that's that chunk of freeform text at the top in the info hash. And that just gets dumped out when you type the info command at msfconsole. We've added info-d for documentation, which allows a module author to create documentation in Markdown. So it's a lot easier to format, it's prettier, you can view it in a browser, and it's just overall a lot cleaner. So this is also a great place to start contributing. If you are not super comfortable with writing code, but you want to give back somehow, writing module documentation is a quick way to give other people your experience in using that module. So if you run a module all the time and you know its ins and outs and you know the best way to run this module in a certain environment, having that in the module documentation is huge for new users. So share your experience, build documentation, and help everyone out in the process. Next, I want to cover some new modules. this is probably the thing that most people are most interested in. And again, these are not super interrelated, but I think they're all very fun. First, we have one for lols where you can set the wallpaper. This one's extra fun because it works on Windows, on OS X, and on Android. So you can go see everybody now. Then we've got the encoders that I mentioned earlier, one of which is for x64, so x86 64-bit. We've had Shikata Ganai for 32-bit x86 for a long time, and it's super awesome at creating very random, difficult to signature on the wire shellcode. And part of the main point of encoders is to be random so that they're hard to sig. And that's not for AV evasion, it's for IDS evasion. A lot of folks look at encoders as AV evasion, and that is absolutely not their purpose. Their main purpose is to remove bad characters so that you can use any arbitrary shellcode with an arbitrary exploit, regardless of the bad character restrictions in that exploit. So the randomness gives you a much better capability of evading IDS. Now, I'm not a Japanese speaker, but from what I've heard, Shikata Ganai roughly means nothing can be done about it, or it can't be better. And Zuto Dekiru was meant as an answer to that, and it roughly means it always works or it can be better. So, same idea. It's a polymorphic XOR additive feedback encoder. So it starts with a key and encrypts each byte with that XOR key as a rolling key as it goes. So it's very, very random and difficult to signature. The next up one is the x86 BMP polyglot encoder. And this one is not a traditional encoder. I mentioned that the purpose of encoders is primarily to remove bad characters. This one doesn't do that at all. Instead, it embeds x86 shellcode into a existing BMP image. So a bitmap image that you would normally serve on a web server or whatever. You can XOR and stegofy all of your x86 shellcode into a bitmap, and then because it modifies the header to actually be executable x86 shellcode as well, you can just put it in memory and fucking jump to it. And that's awesome. Yeah, and that's due to the great work of Zero Steiner sitting over there. I'm going to point you out. Yeah. Next up is SMB delivery, and it works like web delivery. If you've never seen that module or worked with it before, web delivery is basically a web server that hosts whatever kind of script you want. It can be PowerShell and I believe Perl and something else. Mostly we use PowerShell with it to execute arbitrary shellcode in memory without having to drop a file to disk. So SMB delivery works basically the same way, except instead of serving over HTTP, it serves over SMB. Now, a lot of times that won't be available through a firewall, but this is amazing on an internal. Or if you've already compromised something on the inside, having your shellcode come from an SMB file share is like, no one's looking at that. No one pays any attention to SMB file shares. So you're going to fly right past all the IDS and stuff. We also have an exploit for image tragic. This was one of the named vulns, the vulnerability with a logo epidemic continued from the previous years. You've probably already forgotten about this one because it was just not that great a bug. There's been a bunch of bugs with logos trying to drum up a hype for them. And this is an example of one that's it's just not a good bug. It's occasionally useful, and it's kind of cool, and it was worth a module, and it was worth some effort, but I didn't need a stupid logo. Now, one that does need a logo. This is one of my favorite bugs ever. Shellshock is a bug in Bash that allows you to execute code if you control. Yeah. Yes, it's a feature. If you control an environment variable, then you can just execute whatever. So that comes up in a ton of places. And the two main ones that came about in the last year are IPFire, which is a firewall management thingamajig. And then those are really neat, right? Because if you pop a firewall management thing, guess what you've got? Fucking firewalls. So then you can control all the packets on the network. You can change all the firewall rules, all of that sort of thing. And all of this because of a 2-year-old bug that just got overlooked with these devices. And Advantech switches. Advantech is a SCADA vendor thingy that ships with a stupid old bash, like super stupid old, and has all of the same problems. And then the two at the bottom here, Legend IRC bot and XDH IRC bot, I think are hilarious because they're malware. So we have exploits for these two malware bots. It's hilarious. And speaking of malware, we had a few other things. Phoenix Exploit Kit, which is a exploit kit, run-of-the-mill PHP C2 sort of thing. Much in the same vein as like Crime Pack or MPack from back in the day, Firepack, same sort of thing. It has a thing on one of its pages with a variable called, I believe it's BKDR. You can probably guess what that means. Where you can just upload arbitrary shit and put it in the web root, because that's how malware authors roll. Dark Comet is fun, in part because the creator of it stopped development on it after a bunch of Syrian jackasses uses it in a campaign following the Charlie Hebdo attacks. So the creator is French, and these Syrian jerks did a malware campaign with the Je suis Charlie hashtag. And as a result of that, the creator of Dark Comet said, I'm never going to work on a rat again, and took it down and said, basically, you guys are assholes, leave me alone. So if you find Dark Comet out there, it's probably really an asshole. Fun thing, I mentioned that Legend IRC bot and XDH IRC bot were Shellshock exploits. And the reason why that's extra fun is because they were spread with Shellshock exploits. So you're pretty much guaranteed that they're vulnerable. And then on that same vein, we talked about malware. There's also legit security software. And I love the idea of hitting back. And this image doesn't super fit, but I've just always wanted to fucking use it. It's so good. So the Fortinet SSH backdoor was super fun. Again, Fortinet builds these FortiGate things that they're firewalls. They have access to span ports. They are packet capture devices on steroids. So popping one of these things is golden on the network, right? The backdoor itself was basically a change to the way SSH authentication worked, where if you had a particular user, it was a new authentication technique. So instead of like password interactive, it was like Fortinet something or other. And basically if you had a certain random key thing, it would just authenticate you as root, as fucking backdoor. Check rootkit is fun. It was a local privilege escalation where it checked for the existence of a rootkit by looking for a thing in temp called update, just a file called update. But check rootkit is written in bash, and a couple of small missing quotes means that instead of checking for the existence of update, It executed it as root. Yeah, so that one was fun. And then the next two are near and dear to my heart. As you might imagine. The first one, Metasploit Pro's authenticated remote code execution. This is not surprising. If you can log into Metasploit, there's a thing called msfconsole. And msfconsole is basically a shell, right? It has all the same, you can just run shell commands through it. That's what it's for. So if you can log into Metasploit, then you win. Now, you should set a strong password on all of your admin accounts and not give Metasploit Pro to users that you don't trust. But if you allow people to log into Metasploit Pro, very much like if you allow people to log into SSH, guess what? They can run commands. Now, I'm not trying to downplay the significance of this because authenticated code execution by design is by far my favorite class of exploits. I love them because they're not actually exploits. They're not taking advantage of a vulnerability. They're just using the stuff the way it was supposed to be used. So like you log into SSH, you can run commands. That's what it's for. You log into Metasploit, you can run exploits. That's what it's for. The next one though, the pre-authentication deserialization, that's a real actual bug. So please update your Metasploit because this guy's bad. Basically, the known secret key of a Ruby or a Ruby on Rails cookie is code execution. So if you know the secret key, the cookie is encrypted with, then you can decrypt it, you can change it, and you can re-encrypt it and send it back up. And that's serialized Ruby code, so arbitrary execution, whatever you want. This was all the rage back in probably 2014 when it got really blown up by the fact that shitloads of known keys exist on GitHub. So you can just search for stuff to pop. So now the problem in Metasploit crops back up as a result of us failing a little bit on our update scripts that stepped on that key with something that was known to everyone who already had Metasploit. So sorry, but it's funny. And another thing that landed right after Derbycon last year is this thing called Pageant Jacker. It's super cool. The TLDR is you can use a victim's unlocked SSH keys. So basically the way Pageant works is like SSH agent for Unix, but it's the PuTTY equivalent. So it spawns a daemon and holds your unlocked SSH keys. So you can have them password protected, but then still store them in memory and use them without having to type your password every time. So what this module does is it creates a local Unix socket just like SSH agent would. So then you can use a normal SSH client to connect up through that Unix socket, and instead of using your keys that you have unlocked, you're using the victim's keys that they unlocked. So it's hilarious and fun. Yeah, I love SSH keys. They're so much fun. So then we've got a pile of local privilege escalation for Windows. The first two up there are kernel vulnerabilities. And privilege escalation is becoming more and more important in the Windows world. You know, it used to be back in the day, everybody ran as administrator, and if they didn't run as administrator, they ran as power user, which is administrator. And today, that's a lot less true. You know, you still find networks like that where a lot of people are running as local administrator, but it's going away. That has changed significantly in the last few years. So local privilege escalations are becoming more and more important. They're also more important because of sandboxes. So if you pop IE, for example, you end up in a really shitty shell where you can't interact with anything but your own process. All you have access to is the temp directory. Like, it's really restrictive and it kind of sucks. And if you have a kernel exploit, well, then the sandbox doesn't matter. So you skip all of that stuff. You go from super restricted, crappy, sandboxed user, low privileges, to running as the kernel, and all of your problems go away. And on Linux, I mentioned checkrootkit. There were a couple of others that were super fun this year. XM is a mail thingy that, due to some hysterical reasons about how mail works in the Unix world, it has to be setuid root. So the XM executable is setuid root, and it has this it has environment variables that it doesn't clean. You know, it just lets you give it whatever environment variables that you want. And this is a pretty old school style of vulnerability in the Unix privilege escalation world. This stuff is, you know, it's what the really OG hackers were doing back in the 90s, was this kind of privilege escalation. And the way that this one works is you use Perl 5 opt as an environment variable to give options to the Perl command that it eventually shells down to, which lets you run arbitrary Perl stuff. So, yay! Root running as Perl. And Docker daemon is similar sort of to the idea of authenticated code execution, because the Docker daemon doesn't really restrict a user. So if you can talk to the Docker daemon, then you can get out of the Docker. Like, that's kind of what it's for. So if you can talk to the Docker daemon, you can get out of the container, and Bob's your uncle. On OS X, we had this fun one called libmalloc, and it's similar in exploitation to the XM thing, where it has some environment variables that aren't getting cleaned. The malloc log, I don't remember what the exact name of the environment variable, but it's something to do with the way malloc logs its debugging information. So it allows you to put arbitrary contents with some crappy header stuff into an arbitrary file owned as root. So you write a cron line into etc cron tab and wait an hour and go to town. On Linux, we added a few more persistence mechanisms that I think are fun. SSH keys, of course, I mentioned how much I love SSH keys, but they're super useful for all kinds of things. Not least of which is dropping your own SSH key onto a victim system and just giving yourself access to get back in. Being able to log into a system is way the hell better than exploiting something. You know, there's no IDS that's going to freak out because you logged into something. Most people don't audit successful logins. They audit failed logins sometimes so that they can catch brute forcing, but very few networks actually log or audit the logs on their successful logins. So using SSH is just easy peasy. At and cron sort of do what they say they do. You put a payload into an at job or a cron job, and then if you lose your shell, it comes back to you in an hour. Now I want to talk about some specifically Meterpreter features. That was all new modules, and this is mostly things directly related to the Meterpreter shell. First off, packets are now obfuscated with XOR. So it used to be that we had these pretty static pretty static strings that showed up on the wire, and it was fairly easy to signature Metasploit, Meterpreter traffic talking to Metasploit. Now, all of that is encoded with a random XOR key for every packet. So it's a pretty simple obfuscation, but it defeats all of the static signatures. We also added several new extensions. The first one is Python, which allows you to run Python code on the victim. So if you're more familiar with Python than Ruby, this is going to be your favorite thing in the world. We also have a PowerShell extension that works similarly, where you can upload arbitrary PowerShell and have it run in the context of the victim. That one's fun because it uses the system's PowerShell stuff without actually executing the PowerShell executable. So if there's something like AppLocker or any other like whitelisting thing that tells you you can't run PowerShell, this doesn't care at all. It runs it anyway. And the last one there is BF. That was submitted as a pull request by our very own Brent Cook on April 1st. BF is a brainfuck interpreter. Brainfuck is a very simple language. It has 7 operators, and it works basically like a Turing machine on acid. There was a logo. I got logos for Python and PowerShell. There was a logo for Brainfuck, but no. The next thing is the reverse listener Comm, and in the Metasploit socket world, a Comm is a thing that can create new sockets. Mostly, the two that you care about are local, which means that your local attacker machine is creating the sockets via the normal Ruby mechanisms for doing so, and a meterpreter session. Meterpreter sessions can create new sockets connected out, and that's how pivots work. So when you create a route in msfconsole, tunneling things through a session, a Comm is how that happens. We added a new way to create sockets for a server connection. So instead of connecting outbound from the victim machine, you listen on the victim machine and connect to something local to the attacker's network. And it looks kind of like this. So you've got a compromised machine behind the firewall, and it can talk to some other machine behind the firewall, like so, and you compromise that guy, and instead of having him call all the way back through the firewall, you have him reverse his connection to the compromised dude in the middle. In a similar vein, we've also got reverse port forwarding. And a lot of people have been asking for this for a long time because it's super useful for doing all kinds of things. Basically, you add a listener on the victim machine that forwards packets to anything on the attacker's local network, much like the handler setup that I just showed you. So this command here will set up a listener on the remote machine and funnel all connections to port 22 on that machine to port 22 of your local attacker box. Super useful for stealing passwords. And that looks kind of like this, where you connect up to the guy in the middle, you create a listener, and you say to the network, hey, my name is WPAD, any of you want some proxy settings? And they say, yeah, give me that proxy. And then Zoidberg is the popular one. There's another new command called show mount, which does what it sounds like. Yeah, that was pretty good. It shows all of the mounted file systems, including network shares, which is why it's super important. File shares can be your bread and butter on an internal network, where if you can find something that everybody connects up to, if you've got some sort of like scratch share that everybody uses for all kinds of stuff, you drop an LNK file on there with an icon that points to a UNC path for your attacker machine, and you have SMB relay or responder running on that machine, and now suddenly everybody who connects to that file share will attempt to authenticate to you. So grabbing file shares like this is amazingly useful. We've also made some improvements in the Android world. There's this new command called SQLite query, which does what it sounds like. And it saves you the effort of downloading any SQLite databases that exist on the device, which can be slow and time consuming because these devices tend to be on shitty, slow networks. So you're still restricted by your user ID, just like in any other permission scenario. But often the databases that you can talk to are important and things that you want to see. So like if you pop a browser with like stage fright or the older add JS interface exploit, you pop a browser, now you can read all the cookies. And cookies give you sessions that get you into more things and let you expand your influence. So this thing is super cool. Android also now registers itself as a service, which means it runs in the background. And if you run something in the foreground in Android, eventually the user goes and uses something else, and it falls to the background of the app list or whatever. Those processes get killed, so you lose your shell, and that sucks. The service, though, a service runs in the background, and it's very unlikely to get killed in that sort of scenario, unless you're hitting like out of memory conditions or something like that. So this just makes it a lot more reliable. Android in general is a lot more reliable and persistent. So the fact that it registers as a service also means that it gets to start at startup. So if you shut down the device or it goes to sleep, when the device comes back online, you get your shell back. Awesome. So that's most of the features I wanted to cover. Now I want to talk about how you can get involved. These are the places where you can contact me or any of the rest of the Metasploit team. Pound Metasploit in Freenode is where we spend most of our time. People in there are generally helpful, and the jerks tend to get kick banned. So I try to keep it as civil as possible, and I try to keep it as useful and informative as possible. So please come hit us up on IRC and join the community. The community.rapid7.com is our forum, and that's a great place to ask questions and talk about your experiences with Metasploit. At Metasploit on Twitter, of course. I'm also Egypt at Twitter. And GitHub added a new thing called projects, which lets you break up tasks or combine tasks into unique or separate chunks, so you can group issues together, group pull requests together, add notes to them, and keep them in a single location so that you can track them better. We're going to start trying to use these. They're relatively new. We're not certain how it's going to work out, but keep an eye on the projects, and that is going to contain, at least for a while, anything that we think would be an easy thing for a new person to pick up. And we're trying to maintain a list of those sorts of issues. So if you want to get started, you want to start writing some code, or you want to start writing documentation, this is where you can go check it out. We're also thinking about doing a hackathon. This isn't in like real works yet. It's just something that we're thinking about. Can I see a show of hands? Anybody who would be interested in coming to something like this? Yeah? Awesome. That's a lot of hands. Fantastic. So we're thinking about having something in Austin so you can come hang out with the team, maybe for like a week, maybe just for a weekend. It depends on what people are interested in. And hack all the things. Write new modules, work on bugs, create new bugs, because that's usually where I am. So yeah, I would love to do this, and I don't have any of the logistics yet because it's all still very like gleam in my eye sort of thing. But having that number of hands come up makes me feel really hopeful about it, and I think we can make it happen, and I think it would be an awful lot of fun. So are there any questions? Obvious troll is obvious, Mingo. So the question was, HD Moore doesn't have a job. Would we consider hiring him? I think that ship has flown. He now has his own new thing, and he seems to be very happy there. We will continue on without him with his distant guidance. I think we are very much following in his footsteps and upholding the tradition of an awesome community for creating the tool that everyone wants to use. Anybody else? Yes. So the question was about the XOR obfuscation of packets in Meterpreter, and yes, that is the default. All Meterpreter connections now are XOR. I hesitate to use the word encryption because it's more obfuscation, but yes, and in fact, every packet has its own key, its own XOR key. Any other questions? I also have some greets. These are the top contributors according to GitHub in no particular order over the last year. So please thank all these people. Any other questions? Most requested feature we're seeing now. For a long time, it was probably PowerShell integration, better working with PowerShell. We got a lot of that by adding the PowerShell extension to Meterpreter. We're also looking possibly at integrating with something like Empire, because that tool is really cool and super useful, and it does PowerShell better than we do. So we're looking at just taking advantage of other people's awesome open source work. Anybody else? All right. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter or email or whatever. Please, if you want to work on Metasploit, come see me.